looking at where that is beginning to happen in our world, and is not just a dream or a fantasy, but is a reality that people are living into. So thank you for joining us. David, thanks for joining us. I think you're muted. You could unmute yourself. It's the bottom left-hand corner.
Okay, got you now?
Gotcha now. David is an author, a scholar on the board of Yes Magazine, the co-chair of the New Economy Working Group. And thanks for joining us this morning. So, your latest book is about changing the story, changing the world. And you're going to come out and hang out with us in Berkeley in a few months and have this conversation about telling a new story of work. For you, how does this tie into a broader notion of changing the economy?
Yeah, well, first, Jakada, I want to just thank you and express my excitement about being part of this conversation. I'm just thrilled to be connected with the Pacific School of Religion, because one of the things I've come to is this essential importance of breaking down the divide between religion and science and all the rest of the sources of human experience. And as I've looked at academia and how siloed it is and how separated from reality, I've come to the conclusion that our progressive schools of theology may be our best hope for centers to achieve this integration. And just the exchanges we've had have convinced me that you guys are on the forefront of that. So I'm really turned on about it.
Well, thank you, David. That means a lot coming from you, and we're excited to have you in the conversation with us.
It's so important for the human future, because we've gotten ourselves so messed up. And I've also just really enjoyed these discussions about work, because it's forced me to think more deeply about that particular topic and how it ties in with our larger dilemmas of our human story and how we think about the possibilities of our future. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the most foundational issues is work and how we think about work. And what this discussion forces us to do is to realize that in our current economy, increasingly we equate work with a job. Yeah. And a job is something that we have to get money to be able to live, because in our current economy, without money, we can't get food. Increasingly, we can't get water. We can't have a place to live, and so forth. So we get focused on money, and that draws us into what Pope Francis has identified as a foundational theological issue. So we've basically developed a society devoted to the worship of money.
Well, right. Yeah, and so as we have developed this society devoted to the worship of money, right, and that worship, and the act of that worship is the pursuit of that money, right? What does that do to our other relationships? What does that do to our care for the other people in our lives, for the natural environment? This worship of money. What are the impacts of that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Now, I'm going to push that one to a little deeper level.
Push away.
I'm going to take you to one of the defining experiences in my life. It was when I was actually in graduate school, but I spent a summer in Indonesia. It was my first real adventure outside the United States. And a part of that experience is I took a train trip across the island of Java. And this was back in 1961. So it was really before modern development had reached that part of Indonesia. So I was literally cutting through the countryside that had largely been unchanged for thousands of years. It's quite an extraordinary experience. It was one of my first experiences, what I call a true mystical experience, of just sort of melding into another reality, connecting with it at the deepest level.
Hmm.
And as we were going through, it was kind of a slightly cloudy, foggy day, but these beautiful hillsides. And the tradition in agriculture in Indonesia, it's a rice cultivation, irrigated rice. And so you just had this beauty of the humanity, the human element blending into the hillsides. These terraces go right up to the very top of the hillsides. So it's working with nature and in connection with nature. It's not, it didn't flatten out the mountains and plow it up.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all cultivated.
Hmm.
And then we saw the people, the villagers out there working in the rice field, but they were working as a community.
Mm-hmm.
They were tilling the soil. They were working to achieve their livelihood, their means of living, in a partnership with nature and in a partnership with each other. And they were doing it the way they've been doing for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And I thought of the Asian frame of circular time, but living with the dynamics of nature and in the community, you begin to understand how traditional societies lived. There's really no, the movement from dance, from celebration to work, it's all within the cycle of living.
Mm-hmm.
It's being a part of life. Now, as I get into my more contemporary understanding of the economy, and we think about it in terms of the economy as how we define our relationship to our means of living,
mm-hmm.
which ultimately is always dependent on nature. Our food comes from nature, period.
That's right.
Without it, we do not live. You take a deeper look at life and you realize the biologists, the scientists are just kind of beginning to come to terms with the reality that life exists only in community.
Hmm.
And as you understand the physics of life, it can only exist in community because the community has to create the conditions essential to life. Now, this may seem a little far from our discussion of the contemporary economy, but it is the foundation of understanding why we're in such deep trouble and why most of our work is almost, it feels like forced labor, and in fact it is forced labor, and it is an ordeal you tolerate in order to have the means of living so that you can hopefully find some bits of joy in other parts of your life.
Right.
So that brings us back. Now, work is not itself something that's unnatural or is an ordeal. It is part of living. It is part of engaging with life. It's ideally part of engaging with the community and engaging with nature.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, but that I mean, that idea is almost an anathema, right? Like that work is drudgery, it's hard, and that you get what you work for, right? And that those who have the most work the hardest.
Yeah.
What you're saying is runs counter to that.
Yeah, exactly.
so
Exactly. And one of the things that's marveled me so in my life, much of my learning, I've been to business school, I've taught at business school and all that kind of thing, but my real learning is from experiencing life and having lived actually in all parts of the world and the variety of the world's cultures. As we try to sort out why are we in such trouble as a species, the most fundamental truths are those that are, once you see them, they are absolutely obvious. Just like this perception of work.
Mm-hmm.
That work in its best sense is absolutely natural. It's a part of engaging with life. It is a part of our living. And yet, what we've made of it in our current economy is that it's just as you described it. It's, it is literally a form of forced labor.
Yeah.
It's not the exact same kind of brutality of what African Americans originally experienced, but in the conceptual frame, it's very identical.
Mm-hmm.
Because work in our natural environment is just what we do naturally.
So this notion of trading our time and our effort, our labor for a wage, and that should generate some excess that then goes to the owner or the boss or the institution or the company, however, but that it should never be a break even. It should always generate more. What is that more than it's generating? What is it, and where does it come from? And
Yeah, that more is money.
Yeah.
That more is money.
I saw this weird ad, and not to pick on them, but one of these tax companies that does your taxes quite rapidly. They're all over the country. They have this thing where they're giving away $1,000 a day to 1,000 people if you come in and have your taxes done with them. And instantly, I thought, well, why don't they just charge people less? Right? Like, why are they? where are they creating that $10,000 a day that they're giving to people who come and get their taxes done there? Why don't they just charge everyone way less than? So what is that about? That our labor creates excess value, or that labor creates excess value that then is owned by people who aren't producing labor?
Well, that is a very deep question. I haven't heard it framed quite that way, so I don't have an instant answer.
Well, maybe that's one we'll hold for the conference, and maybe that'll be one of our core ones that we'll lead with.
Well, it really has to do with the deeper set of issues. I mean, the production of a surplus is actually something life does. I mean, each individual living being is, in a sense, producing a surplus beyond their immediate needs, because that's the way we get the surplus that we live together on. I mean, the earth is processing nutrients. It's continuously purifying our water. It's maintaining a stable climate and so forth. So there is that surplus, and one of the things that we've learned to do in our human economies is that the earliest people did produce very little surplus. I mean, the hunter-gatherers who were wandering tribes, the only surplus they had was what they could carry, and so it was very limited. Now, we have learned to generate more surplus. Very complicated, because a lot of what we currently think of as surplus is really mining the natural systems of Earth and destroying their capacity to regenerate and thereby support life. So this is part of the tragedy that we are caught up in. But then the other thing we're caught up into is who gets that surplus, whether it is real or imaginary. And the money system is rigged to make sure that it goes to a tiny fraction, what we euphorically call the 1% now. But this has a deep history. I mean, this goes back 5,000 years. The past 5,000 years of settled agriculture is when we've organized as empires. And the whole structure of society is more based on military force than economics originally. But that whole structure was designed so that a small ruling elite could capture whatever was surplus was generated, so they could live in affluent luxuries as defined by the time, while keeping the rest of the population living at bare subsistence.
Now, David, when you say empire, what can you tease that out for us a little bit? Like, what do you?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I use two terms. One is Earth community versus empire. That's kind of the frame of one of my books, The Great Turning. Empire refers to an institutional structure of society that is top down. It's hierarchical. it establishes a very clear class structure so that a few people have the power to control the many. Earth community is actually, you could also call it democracy. It is the deepest democracy. It would be the way the healthiest and most, in a sense, most civil of traditional societies organized. It's deeply democratic, where you do not have a class structure, where, you know, where, and there's some of these societies that still exist where decision making is in the village council. It's kind of the, you know, the most extreme of town meetings, and people talk until there is a consensus and they all agree. That is kind of the, you know, that's almost like Occupy Wall Street's frame, but it's, you know, it is truly deep democracy. Now, the interesting thing, well,
no, please go ahead.
As you think about how life organizes in community, it is in a sense, a deeply democratic process, because it's all self-organized. There's no emperor, there's no king, there's no corporate CEO. It's the most extraordinary thing as you begin to get into it. How does that happen? We hardly have any idea.
No, we call the lions the king of the jungle, because we need to imagine a hierarchy within those systems.
But the king of the jungle spends most of the time laying on his back, just soaking in the sun.
There it is. You touched on Occupy Wall Street, and I want to get your sense, because it could almost sound like that you are sort of that you're imagining us going back to this distant future, and I don't think that's what my sense is that's not what you're calling for. So So as we think about how we are living in this current moment, where are some of the places that give you hope for folks who are thinking about this question or bringing it into action in real sort of actionable living ways, and creating new relationships and new systems?
Well, that's a very good point, and let me hasten to elaborate on that. The reason I look to the past is because part of our task is understanding what are our human possibilities. And one of the things that we're taught currently is that we are by nature individualistic, greedy, and generally violent. Now, those characteristics that we are taught are kind of, you know, the human norm, are actually the characteristics of a psychopath or a sociopath. They are not the healthy human being. And we basically have to go way back to these early societies to get the purest examples that demonstrate we have a very different human possibility. Now, our time is wholly different. There are many more of us. We have to learn to live in ways where we have much more intensive interaction. We also are global. We have a global impact on the earth, and we also have a great deal of additional knowledge and technology. So, I in no way intend to imply that we need to go back to the same standard of subsistence living.
Good. I was getting worried.
But we do have to reduce our overall burdens on Earth, or there's no life for any of us. But what we need to do is exactly the kind of examination that I see you folks organizing there at Pacific School of Religion around this conference, and hopefully a series of follow-up activities to pull together all of this understanding. So how can we join our deepening understanding of our human possibilities and the fact that it is possible, we have demonstrated it is possible to live in deeply democratic communities. But how do we meld that in with our technology? And of course, one of the breakthroughs is our communications technologies, just like the conversation we're having now. Once you post it, it will be instantly accessible to virtually to every human being on this planet. Now, I hope they all watch it. I don't suspect they all will, but this is a possibility that never existed before in the human experience.
Right.
So it means we can communicate, we can act as a species, as a community in a way we never could before, which means we can learn very much faster than we ever have before and learn as a species. So now, how do we organize our economies, which is what you've been trying to get me to for a long time, so that we can actualize these potentials? Well, this is all part of the movements that are happening. That, particularly among the younger generation and the millennials, the youth movement back to the land, back to reconnect with the land, to farming, but new kinds of farming, not the mechanized mass production with all the Monsanto chemicals and all that sort of thing, but using natural methods, but with our most advanced understanding that allows us to get more intensive yields and greater productivity from the land and from our labor. But the youth that are doing this are also farming back into communities. So we are getting more deeply into intentional communities, not as an escape so much, but as living, working communities that are connected in with the rest of the world through the communications technologies, that use all our most advanced methods, but are very much around rebuilding community. Framework of community, the mutual caring, the family, but we're rethinking family structures too. We've no longer got just one form of family. We have many forms of family.
Wow.
But they're all about caring connections.
So there's a couple of things you bring up that are interesting to me. One is this. I know it as comes from the Adikra symbol, the Sankofa, which is this looking back to go forward, right? So reclaiming some histories of our past, which you bring up, and I think as working at a seminary, this studying ancient and sacred texts to try to understand where we've come from and where we're going, I think is hugely important. Another thing you touched on is this recommuning that people are doing in this moment, where they're going back to neighborhood gardens, they're going back to the sort of makering and the maker fairs and the people coming together. So that's just one trend that's happening. Can you also talk about this other trend, which some people call the gig economy? I think of it as sort of the day laborization of the economy. Like I grew up around musicians, and that's something totally different. Like, so gigging, like, I don't know if people are calling this gigging. This feels like sort of almost like we're all becoming sort of day laborers. We stand around waiting for somebody to call on us to work, and we don't necessarily we kind of get to set the terms and negotiate each individual contract, but it is a radically different sort of shift from the idyllic. You get a job, you work there most of your life, and you get a pension when you retire. We're moving into this place where each engagement, each piece of work, is a separate, distinct contract, even if it's mediated by the same company, whether it's the ride sharing or other things.
Yeah, this is fascinating that you bring this up, because our editorial staff at Yes is actually planning an issue on work and jobs, which will be our summer issue, and they've started out with this focus on the gig economy. Now, I think first of all, I was kind of horrified because in no way do I see that as part of the ideal. The work that I've been doing on local living economies is about people rebuilding community, and this is the juxtaposition between people controlling their own land and their own markets and making their choices about how they relate to the environment and to one another and so forth, in contrast to what's happening with the globalization of the economy, driven by things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement,
Mm-hmm.
which strips the communities of all their rights. It absolutely suppresses democracy. And what it's about is securing the rights of transnational global corporations to control our global labor and our global resources. So horrifying. And it's, it has reduced an awful lot of people to this sort of gig economy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an increasingly fragmented relationship. Now, I've been seeing more about how our incredible editorial staff is thinking about that. How can we think about the gig economy in ways that we begin to protect the workers' rights so that they're not just exploited through this? The workers that are put in that position, just like the drivers, the taxi drivers, can form their own unions where they actually control their own gigs,
Mm-hmm.
begin to bring it back into community. And can we think about this in a way that it becomes part of the process of our withdrawing from dependence on the corporate economy and begin to link it into the rebuilding of local economies where we absolutely control our access to jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And part of this, I want to talk about a little bit more about money, but it's also as we really rebuild our local economies, as we grow more of our food in our home garden, as we go back to reclaiming the preparation of our own food, even taking care of our own children, we're reducing our dependence on money. Thereby, we reduce our dependence on the people who control the creation and allocation of money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, David, you taught at Harvard Business School.
I did.
So
As part of my education.
Yeah. So help me understand how somebody goes from some teaching sort of relatively standard, probably business ideas, right, at Harvard Business School, gets to what you're saying, where you have sort of laid out that one of the threats to the human family and the globe are corporations, which are theoretically, these collective structures that allow us to do and achieve things at economic scales that no individual proprietary business or family could do. How did you come to see corporations as such a threat to democracy and to economic democracy and a global future?
Yeah. Another excellent question, which could go on for days because it's got a lot of elements, but I'll try to narrow it down. The thing I taught, it was my field of study in business, and what I taught was business organization.
Yeah.
Now, in its simplest manifestation, it's about how do you organize people in a corporation to make sure that their focus is on the corporate bottom line, financial profits. Okay, so how do you mold the culture, the system of beliefs and stories, and the incentive structures, the authority structures, all around that?
Mm-hmm.
And many of the people in the organization field are actually all excited about when people are really working as a team. They get very excited because they're essentially working as community, and that is our source of real motivation and satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
The question always we're asked, well, if you do that, does it maximize the profits of the corporation? Because that's not legitimate unless it's profitable.
Mm-hmm.
And as many of my colleagues, I was always a little uncomfortable with that, but we had to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
But it also, ultimately, occasionally got into the discussions about ownership and the implications of what happens in a corporation when you get the absentee ownership of public trading. So the ownership shares are traded in public markets, and then this was way back before computer trading because it was before computers. But as all of this has evolved, all has taken on new meaning. Now, the other piece is that I went into business school with a commitment that my interest was in ending global poverty,
Okay.
which is another story. But my theory was that the way we end poverty in underdeveloped countries is by bringing the secrets of US business success so that they can become happy consumers like us, and also come out of very conservative Republican roots. And I was very concerned about these communist revolutions that were a threat to the American way of life. So if we can just make these people, in a sense, you could say good capitalist consumers, they'll give up this communist revolution nonsense. So as I was working in international development, and of course, that involved living and working in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, so in all these different parts of the world, recognizing over time that as people were getting more developed, they were actually being squeezed, and the vast majority of people, into ever greater desperation. A few people are getting quite wealthy, and you were seeing some expansion of middle class and so forth, but a vast number of people were being pushed into harder circumstances. Now, we get all these reports from the United Nations and the World Bank and so forth about how we're ending global poverty because most people now are earning at least $1 a day.
Right.
Now, I ask, have you ever tried to live on $1 a day?
No.
I think you might actually prefer to live in one of the traditional villages where people had no money whatever, but they had food on the table, they had a strong community, their children were happy, they sometimes had a very rich life if they learned to organize themselves properly. So what you begin to realize is that money is not really a measure of well-being in a properly structured world. And what we were seeing is the development is a process of actually alienating people from their ability to create their own livelihood with their own lands and waters and technologies and so forth, and turning those resources over so that the land is owned often by foreign corporations. The water is owned by foreign corporations. You got to buy it in a bottle. And you're losing control of your life. You're being reduced to a situation of dependent servitude. And since people often refer to me as an economist, I say absolutely no, I'm not an economist. Economist is somebody that doesn't understand money, they don't understand wealth, they don't understand values, et cetera, et cetera. Because what this whole process is about is monetizing our human relationships and our relationship to the land. Then gives control over our lives and our access to the means of living to the corporations and the banks that manage and control the creation of money and its allocation. Now, here's the other fundamental truth, and this is the thing that is so obvious once you grasp it, but it's so contrary to everything we're taught, and that is that money is not wealth. Money is just a number. It's an accounting entry. It's an accounting chit. That because of the way we have organized society, if you have to have the chit to have access to the things that you really need, which are food and water and all the other essentials of living. But the money is not really the source of that as a society. As a society, having more money doesn't help you at all in terms of meeting your needs unless you have fertile lands, you have clean waters, you have all the real essentials of living. But our standard economics takes no account of that distinction. All the focus is on the money. And then going back to Pope Francis, our worship of money.
So you said something that was that's profound to me. This notion that development is moving people's relationship to land and water from one of relationship, and if not ownership, connection and responsibility and relationship, to one of what I might call, wage slavery, right? That we're sort of caught in this space of that we can't grow our food, we don't have access to water, and so therefore we have to enter into a relationship as opposed to cultivating those things with some entity that can pay us, so then we can go and acquire those things.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself, that shift is what is meant by development.
Yep, exactly.
Right?
And that also is what a great deal of what we measure as growth in gross domestic product, or GDP, or GNP, GDP.
And so, what do you think of this gross domestic happiness index, or other sort of modes of measuring, instead of quote unquote wealth creation or money creation, or creation of goods and commodities which can be exchanged for money, that we measure something else? What do you think of that?
I think it's exactly the right track. And it's why I'm so interested in Bhutan, which has been at the forefront of that, but is struggling with it. But yeah, and of course, it's important to understand that's not sort of ha-ha happiness. There's a sense of satisfaction, of meaning. I was thinking this morning about a really interesting example. What is the most difficult, the hardest work in the world?
I don't know. What did you come up with?
Raising a child.
Well, praise God, I think you're onto something there.
How much does it pay?
Nothing. In fact, it costs money.
Yeah.
At least
why do we do it?
Oh, yeah. This is an awesome question. I have 4 daughters, so this is a profound deep there is a biological drive, I think. I think there's also this creating community and creating family. Yeah. Oh, we lost you, David. We lost your sound. You're not back yet with the sound. Nope. Oh, there you go. Sorry, you were saying. Sorry, you were answering the question of why we persist in having these children.
Yeah. It's our greatest source of satisfaction, of contributing to life, to the continuation of the species. When we're raising a child, we are engaged in living and in the process of living, and in the continued unfolding of creation. That's a bigger story, but we can get into that at a different time. But yeah, I had never thought of this child raising example until this morning, just getting ready for this conversation, which is one of the reasons I so love this engagement, that it forces us all to rethink these basic questions.
Right.
But I'm even thinking about, why am I engaged in this conversation? You're not paying me anything for this.
True story.
Is there anything I'd rather be doing at this moment in time?
Lunch or something.
Think of any.
Because this is it's. I mean, we've been thinking about this question of life giving, of what gives us life and what feeds and sustains us. That is not, it's not just about our habit to eat food and live indoors and want to wear clothes, which are, all good things. But what is truly life-giving, and how do we support and develop and cultivate that for everyone?
Yeah.
And how do we limit the things which are death-dealing, right? Which draw out our lives, which shorten our lives, which make us.
You mentioned death. This is fascinating because you go back historically. Death was actually one of the ways that the earliest empires kept people in conditions of servitude. Death is not a modern phenomenon.
Mm,
I mean, that's the other thing. We talk about wage slavery, but the other is debt slavery.
right.
And of course, what we've seen, when, well, I don't know about your, when I went to school, went to college, I was fortunate to come from a middle class family, but very few of my contemporaries ended up in debt for going to school.
Ah.
And that was just taken for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Now there are very, very few children that get through college without accumulating a debt.
That's right.
That lands them in a permanent condition of servitude. It's a long time ago. I was in the middle of the night at the hotel. I was watching TV, and it was a group of young people had produced these graphs of what is the difference between graduating from college essentially with no debt, getting a job where you could begin to save a little bit and put it away, versus graduating from college in debt.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the divergence in the graphs is huge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You start out in debt, you are very likely to stay in debt for the rest of your life, particularly in our current situation.
Yeah.
If you can start out on the other side with a little bit of savings, so you're getting a little interest instead of paying interest, that sets the trajectory of your life. So this has been part of the reorganization of society, just in the name of economic growth.
Yeah.
In just the last few decades, and it's a huge difference. And those of our generation, having lived through this transformation, you can see that at work.
Yeah.
The denial of possibilities to people, irrespective of their race, that is getting increasingly worse. And this is why we've got to get this vision of the economy that we want, which is based on deep democracy. And we absolutely have to reject things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which one of my just huge disappointments with Barack Obama is that is now he's made it one of his top agendas, which really makes me wonder: is he working for us or working for Wall Street? It's a terrible shock, but this is the kind of issue that we've got to deal with, because we've got to move in exactly the opposite direction. Our equality issue is not just inequality of income, which is important, but even more fundamental is the inequality in ownership, because the ownership is power, and economic democracy is the foundation of political democracy. I often note that I believe in private property. I believe it's such a good thing that everybody should have some. And essentially what you want is a direct ownership stake in the means of producing your livelihood.
Yeah, no. You hit on something that I think is a huge question. This what is a vision for a different economy, and who has that vision, and how I think historically people have thought that people with progressive, quote unquote, social views had progressive, quote unquote, economic policy and views. And I think the last 50 years has sort of shown that there's that not to hold up. And that's certainly been my experience on a local level. We have a few, one question that's been asked online from PSR's president, David Vasquez-Levy, who wants to start off by thanking you for joining the conversation. And he too is excited about your partnership with New Story of Work. Which he knows is going to be on tax day, April 15th, turns out, is when we're going to be holding New Story of Work. But one of his question is, we're looking to bring together folks from different backgrounds and different sectors to talk to each other, including activists, scholars, business and faith leaders. And, as we think about hosting this conversation, what do you think as central ways that we can not silo the conversation, but sort of get these folks talking across the differences and with each other? So as we're thinking about how we structure this, what are some of the ways you've been thinking about this?
Yeah, that's Whoops, now we're getting feedback. Yeah, that's a process question. How we organize it, and I'm frankly not clear enough on how the conference is structured to be able to say very much about it. I think the goal is to recognize that we tend to get siloed not only in our disciplines, but we also get siloed within progressive movements. That I have my cause may be environmental, my cause may be just, my cause may be that and recognize. Can you hear me?
It's clipping just a little bit. You might turn down your speakers.
Well, I actually turned my speaker almost off.
Okay, that's better. That's better now.
Okay. Yeah, I'm suddenly getting feedback for some reason. Anyhow, we need to recognize that each of these pieces is a contribution that, in the deeper sense, we're all working on the same set of issues. It is redefining our relationship to life, and I think the kind of defining variables are money versus life, which is a deep biblical issue. And I would love to hear you talk about the ancient texts and how they contribute to it. And that's one of the things I hope I'll get from the conference and look forward to hearing more about. And the other is corporate rule, or essentially a form of imperial or dominator system rule versus deep democracy. And a key piece here to me is recognizing the extent to which identity politics, which is a huge issue, actually can play into empire. Because one of the ways in which empire has maintained its power over millennia is by keeping people at the bottom divided. And it divides by gender, by race, by religion, by any other demographic that is easily visible and identifiable. So as we're fighting against each other, we don't notice that the real source of our problem is not each other, it's the system, the system of hierarchy and domination. Now, of course, one of the things that's happening is more and more in the United States, more and more whites are being pushed into the bottom of that dominator system. So those at the bottom, we have more in common than we may have had at one point. And if we can get beyond these differences, so any way that we can manage this conversation in a way that each discipline, each element of the social movements has its place, and it is essential. But we all need to recognize the relationship between our place and the rest, the causes of the other groups, the knowledge that the other disciplines bring together. And then, of course, the big gap between religion and science that you guys are right in the middle of helping to heal.
Yeah. Now, for you, one of the other things that I've noticed that's been interesting, I think I shared with you the other day, that it was this article you wrote around the integral spirit. It was that he sort of posed up that there's these two main narratives of spirituality or religion that are dominant today. One is this sort of like the distant patriarch idea, and the other was this grand machine, right? So sort of this top-down religion of, and that you proposed that there was this third way. And the other day in our conversation, you sort of critiqued the limits of that third way, which I thought were interesting. But at the time, you talked about this third way as the integral spirit. This notion that life and the universe were integrated in all and beyond all, right? That it wasn't this, and that you saw some notions of this sort of, some notions about the limits of this sort of ideas of mystical oneness that were not helpful. And I'm wondering if you could just, give us a minute on that or two on that idea.
Well, it's fascinating the way you phrased it, because this has been part of my own journey. And when I first defined the three cosmologies, I was asked at one point, as you framed it, the distant patriarch, the grand machine, and the integral unity. I was thinking of them as separate, as in conflict. And at one point was asked, are they in conflict? And I said, yeah, they are. They're mutually exclusive. But as I went further into it, I realized that in fact, each one of them has an element of truth that contributes to a larger picture of our understanding of our reality. And the way I think about it now is that the beginning is the integral spirit, or what is more generally referred to as the spiritual unity. That to me is the ground of creation. But I think of it as the spirit, and we can think about it in terms of a human analogy. That when we have the freedom to reflect, our deepest human longing is to find meaning, to find purpose, and to answer the question, why? Where do we come from? Why are we here? What in the world is this thing that we're experiencing about? Which is just, it is really odd. My consciousness, my intelligence. And I don't know, I think about it, if I'm experiencing just the pure oneness, that is also nothingness. Does that have meaning? So I think of the spirit as this desire to know itself, to find meaning, and the only way you learn about yourself is through becoming, through exploring your possibilities, which again, when we're at our best, this is our human drive. And that the spirit suddenly burst forth in this cloud of energy that the scientists describe, which ever since then has been a process of combining into ever greater complexity. And I think of it as a process, the whole of creation unfolding. And it's the way that Genesis summarizes. It's exactly the same large pattern if you don't get down to the technology of how long was a day. But as a metaphorical story, they're very much the same. That it's an unfolding of creation toward ever greater complexity, beauty, awareness, and possibility. Now, within that frame, we're all part of it. And the spiritual unity or integral spirit stories in its classical form, the way I always learned it was, a spiritual development is about shedding our ego and just melding into the oneness.
Yeah.
Now, within this larger frame of the living universe, no, the ego is not a mistake. It is an essential part of our being, of our participation in this grandest of all epic journeys of self-discovery. And that the ego is a tricky deal because it can consume us. And if we get too caught up in our own ego, then we become unable to participate as a member of the community. But this is why I find it very useful to think about our bodies as an analogy also, because each of our bodies is comprised of tens of trillions of individual decision-making cells.
Yeah.
And they all work together in cooperation in some way, self-organizing, each an individual decision maker, to create this extraordinary holder, container, through which our consciousness expresses itself. Wow.
Wow, indeed.
That's pretty extraordinary.
It's profoundly extraordinary. And we're gonna, and this is one of the things that's most exciting to me about the conference, is being able to bring this dimension where we think about the role that spirit, the role that religion, the role that traditional stories can play in helping us understand, even as we move forward, who we are, what we're dealing with, whose we are, and who we are, which I think are some of the fundamental questions of spirituality. Eric asked this briefly. You know, liked your point about the identity politics, and it wants to know how you're thinking about class as a factor can orient or create solidarity across identity politics. So thinking about,
Yeah.
is there something unique about the role of class in that space?
There is, because you know, I don't expect to ever get beyond my identity as a male.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to be a white and you're going to be a black.
Mm-hmm.
And we learn to live together and celebrate diversity, which is also an essential element of a healthy living community. Class is a different thing. The class is an artificial separation.
Mm.
And the interesting thing is, the American ideal, when I was growing up, was the middle class society.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idea by the mythology, there is no lower class, there is no upper class, we are all middle class. Well, that's kind of an interesting idea. That really goes back to, I mean, the original intact and healthiest indigenous original societies were classless societies. And it is a possibility, and that to me is a goal. And you know, we tend to associate that with this terrible thing that Marx talks about, but it actually was Adam Smith's vision as well, and Thomas Jefferson's. It was a society of small businesses, of small farmers, of people who actually own directly their means of production, not in the fiction of some distant state owns it on my behalf, but real ownership. So, you know, I think in many ways our goal is a classless society. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody has exactly equal wealth, because, you know, it does make sense that people who contribute more have get a bit more as a reward. But that is very different from a society in which very few people just live in the most extravagant of excess, and other people struggle to find a crumb on the ground so they can try to survive another day. So class is something that we definitely need to recognize, and including the fact that those of us who are members of more privileged classes, that given the trends in the world, they are such that if we do not support and participate in the movement toward a more equitable and truly democratic society, there's no future for any of us.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think that it's this question of race, gender, class, sexual orientation is all very complicated, because I think in multiple societies that have tried to crack this nut, you end up with women and the darkest people and queer people being at the bottom of those systems and societies, even when they suggest they will be classless. And so there's something that's sort of very, and you know, David, thank you so much for you've been such an incredible partner. Thanks to the folks who joined us online. Sorry for any questions we didn't get to, but please join us April 15th and 16th. Go to Ignite at PSR or ignitepsr.org to sign up. We still have early bird registration available. This is a very important conversation. It's ongoing. We didn't start it, and we're not going to finish it all, but we're going to do our part to add to what we can. And David, I'm so happy and excited to have you as one of our partners in this project. Be on the lookout for other upcoming webinars and continued conversation and dialogue and opportunities to engage with us as we do this work going forward. Be well. May the spirit that brought you continue to be with you and protect you.
See you all there.
See you soon. Bye-bye, all. Thank you.